Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our conversations through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to Song of the Open Road, passage number 3. Now, the assumptions here that you've been with us through our study at learnstrong.net. You can, down the left-hand side, find that Talks with Walt playlist. And our hope is that you have your own copy of Leaves of Grass, and you've been annotating with us since the very beginning, inscriptions. We're even going to mention, starting from Paumanok actually in this lecture, all of those echoes that bring us up to Song of the Open Road. I've already given an introductory set of comments, and as well we've worked now with parts 1 and parts 2. Now, as we get ready to read this passage, just pay attention to all of the U's, at least 25, and all of the exclamation points, 19, in a poem that technically is only 14 lines long. So obviously a whole lot of enthusiasm is a part of this one, right? And as we get into this, notice that we'll be talking about the urban, the city especially, will be the celebration that Whitman, and we've seen this already many times, yes? You air that serves me with breath to speak, you objects that call from diffusion my meanings and give them shape, you light that wraps me in all things in delicate, equitable showers, you paths worn in the irregular hollows by the roadsides, I believe you are latent with unseen existences, you're so dear to me. You flagged walks of the cities, you strong curbs at the edges, you ferries, you planks and posts of wharves, you timber-lined side, you distant ships, you rows of houses, you window-pierced facades, you roofs, you porches and entrances, you copings and iron gates. You windows whose transparent shells might expose so much. You doors and ascending steps, you arches, you gray stones of interminable pavements, you trodden crossings. From all that's touched you, I believe you have imparted to yourselves and now would impart the same secretly to me. From the living and the dead, you have peopled your impassive surfaces, and the spirits thereof would be evident and amicable. We'll finish with this observation. The only time amicably gets used in all of Leaves of Grass. We like to point out some of the diction, some of the verbiage choices of Whitman. Notice, we're going to continue with the opening line of part 2 with this word you, right? And it's not really always clear when Whitman uses the word you exactly what the antecedent to the pronoun is. Here, of course, we're talking specifically about what it is already on this open road that Whitman will witness. Notice he'll begin with the air, and of course his idea of the air and the science that he was so impressed by is going to be a part of this, standing behind this. We'll go back to Eidolons and inscriptions if you want. You air that serves you with breath to speak, and this power of speaking and the words and the power of words is always a part of Leaves of Grass. You objects that call from diffusion, this will be the only use in Leaves of Grass for this, my meanings and give them shape. The idea of diffusion, go back again to our conversation with Eidolons, this idea of the science and the way in which everything grows out of something else, the organic nature of the poetic attempt is part of what we are obviously emphasizing here. Notice, we'll come back now to light, which obviously we've spent a lot of time talking about with Leaves of Grass. You light that wraps me, and he loves that kind of word picture of being wrapped around or swallowed up. Wraps me in all things. And then what an amazing line. Delicate, equitable showers. And I said to you guys, hey, I love reading this stuff out loud. When I can, I love to be able to read the full lines before we even talk about them, just so you can hear the music of the poetry, right? But as you yourselves began to write your own poetry, pay attention to the ways in which there's this verbiage that has this beautiful melodic lilt to it, right? This delicate, equitable showers. Notice light that wraps me in all things in this shower of beauty, right? You paths, and of course all the exclamation points. Enthusiasm is a huge part of this passage. You paths, we're going to hear a lot about this in Song of the Open Road. Paths worn in the irregular hollows by the roadsides. Everything obviously is for Whitman always, at the same time, of literal as well as, of course, metaphysical or figurative, really, right? It's always going to be that way. And so he's not just interested in the popular road. He's also interested in what happens on the edges, on the sides of the road. Back to passage 2 and his inclusivity, as we saw already. And then he'll use this phrasing. that is so popular in Leaves of Grass. This idea of I believe. We'll come back to this over and over again with this I believe, right? Already some of you are smiling because you will remember the times that he has already played this game, right? I believe, he says, you are latent, one of the words he loves in Leaves of Grass, right? Potentiality. With unseen existences. I mean, go back to the opening lines of passage 2. I believe that much is unseen. Much unseen is also here, right? I believe you are latent with unseen existences. You are so dear to me. Think about the way he puts this poem together. So the unseen is mentioned in the opening line of passage 2. Look at the last line of passage 2. That notion of being dear to me. So you've got this beautiful kind of encapsulation. This, can we call it wrapping, since that's what he's calling it? Why not? By the way, our old fuselage will come back to this dear to me one more time. You flagged walks, you see the alighted verb, you flagged walks of the cities. Now, we're going to celebrate for the rest of this cities, and we'll be thinking about, Brooklyn Ferry. That is the poem to follow this one. You strong curbs at the edges. And of course, the idea of sidewalks, I mean, if all you got to do is study urban development, especially New York, to see that Whitman, when he's very young, lives in a much different New York, much less cement, fewer paved streets and the like, than obviously when he becomes much older. And so again, the idea of curbs and living at the edges can be both literal as well as obviously figuratively. You ferries, we're going to come back to crossing Brooklyn Ferry in our next poem. You planks and posts of wharves, timberline sight, distant ships. We've already commented on his passion for ships and for the whole idea of shipping going every which way, right? You rows of houses, you windowed pierced facades. We're going to come back to this word facades one more time in Broadway pageant. You roofs, you porches and entrances, you copings and iron guards. In other words, Whitman was a great walker, especially, of course, of the city of New York. And he loved to report in his notebooks about all the stuff that he saw. It was almost like he was photographing with words everything that he saw. And here, of course, he's playing the game for us. You windows, and obviously windows can be both literal as well as metaphysical or figuratively here, and we're going to see both. You windows whose transparent shells, you can't read something like that without thinking about Emerson and the transparent eyeball, right? Transparent shells might expose so much. This idea of exposure, we're going to come back to, just to write it down in passage 13. I know all and expose it, he will say. So there's a whole lot going on with his use of the word expose. You doors and ascending steps. Of course, the idea of ascending is always going to be powerful in Leaves of Grass. You arches. You gray stones. And obviously we're commenting on architecture here. And if you'll think about it, it's fascinating to study an old city like New York in regards to architecture, because so much of that city is organic in the way that it grew up, and yet obviously there was some hopeful intentionality among city engineers and the like, right? He says, gray stones of interminable pavements. Now, this word interminable, if it sounds familiar, it should. Go back to starting from Pomanog passage 2, an audience that is interminable, that is to say endless, ongoing, always happening, the pavements that seem to be never ending. If you watch a city grow up over years and years, you will see a lot of pavements that will grow and grow and grow, right? He says, you trodden crossings. Now, obviously the word crossings with the word ferries earlier, and the fact that you know that crossing Brooklyn Ferry is coming begins to make you already smile. Of course, the word trodden, and the way in which trodden gets used in Leaves of Grass already, is going to as well make us smile. I mean, just think about it in paths untrodden that we've already studied, right? From all that has touched you, right? In other words, cities are touched by those of us who live in them. Of all that has touched you, I believe, and again, we've heard this already 25 times in Leaves of Grass, we will hear the poet say, I believe, I believe, I believe, right? It's an interesting way for us to study Leaves of Grass from the epistemological perspective. What is it that you believe? What is it that you know, right? From all that has touched you, I believe you have imparted to yourselves, and now would impart the same secretly to me. I mean, we're going to say this here in a second, that in some ways we're defined by where we live, right? And we define where we live in some ways. There's a symbiosis there. Notice he says, you've been touched and you have touched me. He says, and now would impart the same secretly to me. Now, this use of the word secretly, we'll remember it in recorders ages hence, right? Go back and look. Obviously, there's a whole reading of Leaves of Grass. How much Whitman longs to expose, to use the word from earlier, the secrets of his life. Obviously, we will try to read often between the lines to divulge some of those secrets. He says, from the living and the dead, which is obviously kind of a biblical reference, you have peopled, it's an interesting use of the word, you have peopled your impassive surfaces, and the spirits thereof would be evident and amicable, only use in all of Leaves of Grass, with me. In other words, he wants to celebrate that this open road is a road that will include the cities. So when he says open, he doesn't just mean out in the country, right? Clearly. So he's going to join in his voice all of the important elements of America, not just the urban, but as well the country or the rural, both together. Well, what are we going to say at 2A really quickly? Well, yeah, in some ways we really are. In so much of our lives, the cities that we live in and the towns that we live in, right? In some ways, you are, right, where you live by virtue of what you live, right? They're symbiotic. At 2B, again, the repetition in the word choice here is always fascinating. Why in this passage are there so many yous over and over again? And what's up with all these exclamation points? Some faulted Whitman for his use, his overuse of the exclamation point, and the way in which certain writers like to do this and others avoid it. At 3A, I've mentioned Brooklyn Ferry already, although let's write down at 3A a poem that we love in 303, of course, Carl Sandburg's Chicago. We've given a full lecture on it at learnstrong.net elsewhere. But the celebration of the city and the celebration of the urban and the ways in which we are defined by the cities that we get to live in, and they define us in some profound ways. And then finally at 3B, what is your favorite city, and what is your love or dislike of cities, and to what degree are you defined in some ways by the very cities or towns that you live in or don't live in, we might say. I hope that you're enjoying your study of Open Road. Thank you.